Hi, welcome to Lachlan Likes a Thing, a show where I take a thing and see whether or not I like it. Now the thing we're looking at in this video is the Sony XBA-H1 hybrid in-ear earphone. Now by hybrid that means that this earphone actually has in each earpiece a full range balanced armature driver and a dynamic driver. And I've confirmed from talking with Koji Nagano, who is the chief sound engineer at Sony, that this is the same balanced armature unit as found in the XBA-H1 and the XBA-C10. And they were both earphones that I enjoyed quite a bit. So the whole point of adding the extra dynamic driver and having a hybrid design is supposedly you want to be able to fill in the bass line with the dynamic driver. And we'll get into what that means for the sound of the H1 in a moment. But I found that in my review of the XBA-H1 and the XBA-C10, bass was one major area where those earphones were lacking. Now, I picked up this H1 for $110 just from a store that sadly was closing down, so I was able to get this at a good clearance price. The recommended retail price is a fair bit higher than that. In terms of design, the XBA-H1 is, as you can imagine, quite a large earphone because they've had to put in the dynamic driver and the balanced armature into the same earpiece. So you get something that's quite large and quite bulky. But that said, it's also completely made out of plastic, so it's also quite lightweight. It's actually surprisingly lightweight given the size of the earphone. In terms of overall build quality, I think the H1 is quite nice, despite the overall all-plastic build. The strain reliefs are quite good. As for the cable itself, we have a flat red and black cable, which may or may not be to your taste. But we have this, Sony cable where all the new Sony cables have the serrations that run along the length of the cable, and this is supposedly to keep the cable from becoming tangled. In practice, I've found that this actually works quite well, so again, quite happy with the cable on the H1. And on the other end, we have the classic 90-degree jack, and again, this is quite nice and secure in overall build quality. Now, in terms of comfort, again, we use Sony's silicon hybrid tips, which are my favorite ear tips. And pretty much you can only wear the XBA-H1, well, it's least awkward to wear just hanging straight down with the cable going straight down, as you can see. The earpieces, although they are quite lightweight, they are still quite large, so if you have a smaller outer ear, you may find that this earphone will be uncomfortable. And as you can see, the way the H1 works is that it sticks out of the ear. It's not a negative profile fit. You can wear it around the ear like this, and that kind of relieves some of the tension and the weight from the earphone. But overall, I do kind of really wish that Sony went with a negative profile design like that of the Shure SE215, because this kind of design, when you put it in your ear, it's much flatter overall, much lower profile. You don't get wind noise, because the problem with a design that sticks out of your ears is that when it gets windy, the wind will blow around it and you do get wind noise as a result. So I do kind of wish that they had adopted a negative profile design for an earphone where the earpieces are this large. The thing about the H1, one nice thing is that isolation is quite high. This is a fully sealed design. There's no vents or ports. So isolation is good on trains and on your commute, but again, wind noise can be a factor. So in terms of sound, the XBA-H1 sounds exactly like you would expect if you took an XBA-H1 or an XBA-C10 balanced armature driver and you added a dynamic driver to boost up the bass response. So you do get a much thicker, a much warmer sound overall, with quite a substantial bass impact along the lower frequencies. The overall earphone, as a result, sounds thicker, it sounds warmer. Now, in terms of actual sound, I do think that Sony has done a good job of what they set out to do, which was to integrate the dynamic driver and the balanced armature driver together. There's no crossovers in this earphone, so it's pretty much going to be very, very well integrated, the two sounds. But the problem I have with the H1 is that one of the big critical issues with the C10 and the XBA-H1 were that for a balanced armature driver, and this is probably the case with any single balanced armature driver, it really lacked bass, but it also really lacked treble extension as well. You got this kind of blunted quality to the sound, and so somewhat of a brittle and kind of feathery treble region. This is not really solved on the H1 by adding the dynamic driver, and in fact it's kind of made even worse because now you have quite a thick, substantial bass line, but you do really lack that sense of air and space from the treble extension. So I find that as a result, string instruments, vocals, all those kind of things do end up sounding blunted. They sound fuzzy on the H1. And while this is kind of forgivable on the XBA-H1 and the XBA-C10, which were earphones that cost about $20 to $40 at street prices, this earphone costs several times that amount. And especially if you compare it to the Shure SE215, and I think this is a really worthwhile comparison because these are both very thick sounding earphones. The Shure SE215 is in fact thicker, it has a bit more of a bass kind of hit, but also in the treble region, it actually has more extension. It actually has more of a sense of air and space. So this earphone, if I had to pick an earphone that I would recommend for people who are after a warmer or a thicker sound, I think this SE215 sounds more natural. And coupled with the fact that it has a negative profile fit, it has detachable cables, overall a really nice package that has been put together by Shure, and it actually costs less than the XBA-H1. I would not really look at the H1 unless you were absolutely allergic to high frequency treble. Like for whatever reason you were very sensitive to the sound, then I would look at the H1. I don't think the H1 is a terrible sounding earphone, but I feel like that the addition of the dynamic driver to the balanced armature driver didn't really solve any problems that they were looking to solve. I mean, I've heard lots of single dynamic driver earphones around this price range which I think sound better than the H1. So the only thing that the H1 really has got going for it is that because of the lack of any ports or vents, the isolation is higher. But the trade-off is that we get this large earpiece, which again, I think they should have gone with a negative profile design. I do have a review up of the Shure SE215. If you haven't seen that, check it out. This is still, after I think many years of release, a really good value earphone. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. Please click the like button if you found it helpful. Thanks again to all my regular subscribers. You can talk to me on Facebook at facebook.com/LachlanLikesAthing or on Twitter @LachLikesAthing, and happy listening.